One thing that I've been drifting towards is more. Boy, I don't know how to say this without sounding like a complete piece of shit. Is drifting more towards substantive as opposed to what I consider nominal thinking. I'll take one clear example of what I'm talking about because I can't really define what I'm talking about, so I'll just use examples of what I'm talking about. Free speech. Substantive versus nominal free speech. Now, in the United States, you have nominal free speech. Nominally, you are allowed to say just about anything except make threats against certain politicians. And those are the only threats that are actually enforced. Of course, on a substantive, on a nominal level, I think apparently you're not supposed to make threats against anyone, but substantively, nobody cares if you make threats against other citizens. They only care if you make threats against the political class. So, substantively, you can make threats against non-politicians. You can't make threats against politicians. Okay. And on the matter of free speech, what you have in the United States is general allowance of other people to say things. To say things, for example, well, race exists and race differences in cognitive functions. Let's use that as one example. I think that's a good, litmus test for is free speech available. Or, the Holocaust, I think, is another good litmus test. Now, it's one thing to say, okay, you're allowed to say that. It's another thing to actually listen. Because let's say these people over here are allowed to say something that goes against the more popular views about something, but these other people don't listen. Or if they do listen, it's a very hyphenate or very asterisky form of listening. It's more of a listening just enough so you can argue against, make very simple arguments against that collapse complexity. We know the drill. We know the sophistry. Anybody who's ever gone against the mob knows the sophisticated the sophisticated sophistry of these people. And in that sense, I don't think you have substantive free speech. Right? Because if people aren't listening, well then, what's the point of the free speech? In a sense, I mean, I don't know which is better or worse. I'm leaning towards, well, I don't know which is better or worse. Having certain views just outlawed, that it is de jure illegal to say certain things, or to have the general public be so conditioned to oppose a view and to ignore a view that it's legal to say, but it's just ignored. Because if a view is outlawed, well, people don't like being told what they can and can't listen to. Right? And so there may be a certain backlash against the outlawing. Right? And if a certain view is just outlawed, but the people are not preconditioned against a certain view, then I think that would be preferable to them being conditioned against it. Now, in countries like Sweden and Central European countries, not only do you have a conditioning against certain views, but you also have the views outlawed. So in those states, you have all the condition, perhaps even more conditioning than exists in the United States, plus the outlawing of the views. So it's a double whammy against more complex thought. So I say free speech. Well, what do you mean by free speech? Like free speech, you're just going to allow them speak, but you're not going to listen? Well, the point of free speech is that the views get aired and then you listen. Okay. If nobody's listening to a certain view, then the free speech is worthless. Okay, and you can say, well, that's just because the quality of the view. No, that's opinion. That's your subjective view. And plus, how can you? How did you come to that subjective view if you've written off a certain idea in the first place? Right? If you said, well, this is all kooky wrong, from the outset, you've written it off as wrong, and therefore you're not going to listen to it. You say, well, why don't you listen to it? Well, because it's wrong, and a bunch of crazy people say it, right? Which is wonderfully circular reasoning, or professor says so, something like that. So that's one example of this substantive nominal distinction. Yes, nominally you have free speech, but it's the substance that matters. If you're not listening, then there is substantively no free speech. Right? Okay. Another thing would be multiculturalism. Right? This nominal substantive distinction. When someone says multiculturalism, okay, well that's the kind of theory is that you, instead of the one culture that exists in Britain or existed in Britain in the year 1948, we have Hindi and Islamic and Afro-Caribbean culture as well, in addition to white Christian British culture, right? So it's multiple instead of just one. That's the idea. Now, in reality, people in the United States and Canada and probably Britain, I'm not quite as sure about that, have access to Japanese cartoons, Japanese art, Japanese technology, and anime, or Japanimation as the young'uns are calling it. They have no problem spreading throughout the world, right? You don't have to have some sort of program at a university to get people to embrace anime. Right? You do have to have some sort of active program to get them to embrace anything involving stuff invented by black people or Muslims or the Islamic world, right? Because people in Britain, without some sort of Islamic exposure, nobody cares about Islam. Nobody, right? They like anime, right? Anime can gain ground without any program push, and so when we say multiculturalism, well, we have multiple cultures, good food, right? Mexican food is made in the United States in the absence of Mexicans, right? You don't need Mexicans to have Mexican food. You don't need Japanese people to have sushi. We don't really eat. There's not really any real African food that people eat because I don't know if there's any. I don't know for sure, but I don't know of any. Know that of African food from any region on the continent of Africa being good at all. You even have little shops that sell German food, right? And you don't need Germans for that. So in terms of like the things that these other populations around the world, their norms, their food, their art, there's no problem for the good stuff to travel, right? I don't know if anyone has ever been to a German food restaurant. I don't know how accurately it recreates German food, but I went to one and it was surprisingly flavorful. I thought it would be boring. I thought it would be potatoes and meat and green beans or something like that. But it was actually very, very good. I was shocked at how good it was. So multiculturalism. Well, prior to the importation of large populations of either mestizos, Africans, Muslims, or Southeast Asian people, Arabic Muslims, or Southeast Asian Muslims, or Indian peoples, there has been no problem absorbing the ideas from other quote-unquote cultures. Right now, I don't really like the word culture. I think that we should speak. Okay, do you mean recipes and food? Okay, You mean art? Okay. So, so even without importing any of that, you have all that, right? You have access to all that, right? Modern communications technologies have made it so that every country on the planet is multicultural. Okay? Every country on the planet is multicultural right now. So when someone says, well, we're going to make Sweden multicultural, what do they mean? Do they mean they're going to bring in more anime? Do they mean they're going to bring in more Japanese and Korean video games? Do they mean they're going to get Swedes to put down that Swedish computer and start using, Korean and Japanese made computers? Oh wait, they already are doing all of that. Okay, so in what sense is Sweden to be made more multicultural? Oh, we're gonna. Well, what they mean is that they're going to bring in African and Muslim populations. That's what they mean. Right? Now, in terms of the kinds of things that Japanese people do, right? There's a huge subset of people in the United States who love to emulate Japanese, right? And think they're just so cool because everything's better in Japan or whatever, right? But you don't have that for the Muslim world. Right? You don't have a subset of people, I mean, except for the actual Muslims who have been imported to the United States. You don't have a bunch of people who were otherwise raised among non-Muslims who then go, wow, I'm going to emulate the Muslim world. We're going to try to live like Muslim people. Let's dress up the ladies in the burqas and pray to Mecca 20 times a day and, all that crap. Like, they don't do that. They don't do that because that culture sucks. So what multiculturalism really means is the importation of shitty culture, right? Because the good culture gets imported, just as is. Right? And it means the importation of shitty culture and those people. And so that's a real distinction, right? So we're already multicultural. The world is already multicultural, okay? There doesn't have to be any government program or importation of populations in order to achieve multiculturalism, because multiculturalism already is achieved. So when people say multiculturalism, what do they actually mean? What they mean is bringing in people that nobody wants, right? It doesn't mean bringing in doctors and engineers because countries already want those. No, it means a political program to bring in people without value, right? People who don't provide value, people who tend to be criminal, and in prior ages were regimes did their level best to keep them out, okay, and to legally enforce cultural norms in given areas that go against what anything, for example, white people in Britain. You bring in a bunch of Muslims, well, certain areas become Islamic. And, for example, you have an area here and there say, well, don't fly the Union Jack because that's offensive to the Muslims. Right? That's what is meant by multicultural. Now we're going to have more Muslim MPs. And we're going to have more people controlling the levers of power of the state, which controls what you're allowed to say, what taxes you pay, who gets to go to university, right? That's we get more and more influence of the Muslims. Now, in a broader historical sense, multiculturalism is a transitional phase. It's not something. Well, excuse me, not multiculturalism. Multiracialism, right, is a transitional phase. It's not something that lasts, right? Because, I mean, that's just a general rule of thumb, is that things don't coexist, right? I mean, I would just recommend to anyone just going to a bookstore, finding a world atlas, even though the world atlas, I mean, it's going to have the bias of today's day and age, which is, against racism and pro-democracy, and they're going to paint, the rise of democracy as some evolutionary process and this is the zenith and all that stuff, and they're going to have all those predictable biases. But even with all those biases, what you see is that things don't coexist, right? Zoroastrianism doesn't really exist much in Iran anymore. Okay, the Copts in Egypt are a very tiny and shrinking minority. All right, the Middle East used to be dominated by Jews. Now it's dominated by Muslims because the Muslims drove them out. Right, they did not coexist. It was not, you know, multiculturalism is, religions and races don't coexist, right? Either one displaces the other, or they merge into a new single thing, right? And you see that in a sense in the country Mexico, where the Spanish and the Native Americans have largely merged into a. You could say, well, they're mixed race. Okay, but they've merged into a new mixed race, which is what we call mestizo, right? It's a blend of two prior races, and we know which ones those are. But functionally, they become a new mono race. Now, in Mexico, you still have, clearly more Spanish-looking people and clearly more native-looking people. And so this process of homogenization is not finished in Mexico. But the process is still going. And we can see in the rise of the mestizo the kind of person that this produces. And guess what? It's not Superman, right? It's not, it's weird. It's weird you have all these people who talk about how, belief in race differences is some sort of pseudoscience, but then just proclaim that mixed race people are genetically superior. We have this new man. We have this new mixed race man. In this case, it's a mixture of natives from the region of the former Aztec Empire in the southwest United States, and Spanish people, and they mix, and what do they produce? Well, it's not Superman, definitely not. It's a group of people with intermediate traits. For example, in terms of height, mestizos are in between Spanish and natives, intermediate. That's what you get. You get intermediate traits, right? So, and that's the end game of multiracialism, is a new mono race, a new mix. Well, you could call it a mixed race. Well, I mean, okay, fine. But it functions as a single race, functions as a new single entity. You end up having a new single political ideology, right? In fact, now the problem with people who live in the United States is that they view these minor differences between the Republican and Democrat Party as being like Thuper-Theriath, kind of like Lutherans and Methodists imagine that they have big disagreements with each other or something, and so they form different Christian sects. But I mean, the Republicans and Democrats, they're basically identical. On social issues, they're identical. Both Republicans and Democrats support gay marriage. Republicans want to call it civil unions or whatever. They want to keep the name marriage for males and females only. But substantively, they're identical on that. Both parties support Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and this might be something I talk about in another video in terms of public opinion and conservative and support for that which exists that people have. In terms of expanding the domestic budget, Republican and Democrat administrations have been virtually identical for as long as can be measured. So. Foreign interventions, foreign interventions is far more contextual, since the world is far more contextual. But I mean, the Vietnam War, Bill Clinton's invasion of Yugoslavia, Obama's, maintaining the war in Iraq and Afghanistan and doing a little bit in Libya. And you can say, well, Obama didn't initiate as much foreign policy adventures as Bush did. Well, okay, but again, context. I mean, what could Bush get away with in the wake of 9/11 versus what can Obama get away with in the wake of a backlash against foreign intervention, right? So it's an apples to oranges comparison on that. But what I'll say on foreign intervention is that they're hard to distinguish. That's what I'll say. The Republicans and Democrats are hard to distinguish. If you want to look at World War I and World War II, well, World War I, U.S. intervention was caused by Woodrow Wilson. And of course, it was the promise of U.S. intervention that kept the war going on. That's what kept France and Britain. Germany wanted to provide a status quo peace, so the war could have ended in 1916. But the French and British governments held out for the United States entering the war. That's what happened. And so it was this promise of U.S. entry into the war that kept the war going on past the year 1916. At least the war between Germany and France and Britain. As for the war between Russia and Austria-Hungary, that's a bit more. I think that war would have ended had Germany fallen. I think that war would have ended because if France and Britain were no longer at war with Germany, Germany would remain at war with Russia. There's no way Russia could defeat both Germany and Austria-Hungary. Then there would be a truce between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia, and that would be the end of the war. Right? But of course, that war was prolonged because of the promise of U.S. entry into the war, thanks to Woodrow Wilson, a quote-unquote progressive. Right? He called himself a progressive. So, this idea that the parties differ substantively on foreign policy, I just don't see it. On domestic policy, I don't see that either. I look at the expansions that Bush did, the bailouts. Well, Obama did the bailouts. I don't. Anyway, so what we see in the United States is a homogenization of political views as well, right? If you go back to say the Civil War, for example, is a great example of the great diversity of political views that existed in the United States in the past. Political diversity that does not exist today, because things don't coexist. Eventually, ideas homogenize over a region. Religions homogenize over a region. And races homogenize over a region unless there are laws to prevent race mixing. And so let's say you bring in a bunch of Africans into Britain. You don't have any laws against race mixing. What's the final result of that going to be? Well, the final result of that is going to be that Britain is going to be a bit less European and a bit more African in its finality. Right? Because eventually those populations are going to mix throughout the entirety of the British population, and the entire British population is going to have a little bit more Negroid features and temperament and cognitive functions. And even if we have a problem here is that people watch this video, they're operating on completely different assumptions that evolution doesn't apply to the brain in terms of racial differentiation. You have racial differentiation in every other part of the body, but including brain size and shape, that's also a fact, as more modern methods can attest to. Gould can say whatever he wants about the methodological problems of the old scientific racialists, but their results have been largely confirmed by more modern methods, which calls into question Gould's criticisms. So the end result is going to be a population in Britain that is a bit less European and a bit more African, a new monorace. It's not going to be multi-races, it's going to be a new monorace, right, that looks and acts a different way. Right? That's the result, right? It's just like with Mexico. The final result is not going to be Europeans and natives. No, it's going to be a new monorace that looks like a mix between Europeans and natives. Right? It's going to be a new single race. So when someone says, "Well, I'm for a multiracial Sweden," no, you're for a different monorace that is less blonde and more fugly. Right? And I know that I shouldn't say this, and this is kind of crude and rude to say, but let's face it. Swedes look a lot better than Africans. Like, they really do. I don't think anyone can really. I mean, maybe some black people will argue that, but I don't think anyone. I think only black people will argue the opposite. But I mean, really, like they're pretty. And so why would you want? I mean, just on that, why would you want a bunch of people come in? Like you recognize, like let's say you believe that they're equal in cognitive abilities. Okay, they're equal, but they're uglier. So why would you want a group of people that's uglier? Right? Even if everything else is equal, which I mean is kind of weird, kind of a weird thought that they would be identical in cognitive tendencies. These populations that evolved in different environments and evolved different shaped and sized brains that they would have identical brain function. It's such an odd notion. Okay, but even if they're equal in all these traits, but like that's the finality of it, is a new mixed monorace that looks a little less good, that looks a little more African, a little less European. That's it. That's the final result. Another thing regarding the freedom of speech and substantive freedom of speech is speech codes at universities. Now, the university is, and I have a chapter on this in my book where I provide evidence of this, but we could say that if you want to know what the political views of the future are going to be, you just look at the university faculties. That's what you do. Right. The idea, I mean, social views, for example, start out in the universities and then translate to the rest of the public. Anti-sodomy laws are an example of this. Right? University professors were pro-homosexuality long before the general public was. Right? Whatever your views on that, I'm not making a normative judgment here. I'm just describing the fact that views that start out in the university spread to the rest of the general public. Views regarding racial segregation, right? Desegregationism, or integrationism, depending on how you look at it, started in the university. Then that sentiment spread to the rest of the general public. Same thing with scientific management, or the idea of a managed economy and social safety net. That came from Prussia. That came because I forget the years. I believe it was it was before World War I, obviously, and it was when Prussia existed. So, when was the unification of Germany? I don't know. But this was a period at which universities in the United States did not have PhD programs. So if you wanted to get a PhD, you had to go to Germany. And the result of this was that people would go to Germany and they would get convinced of the idea of a managed economy. All right, in terms of and this is, of course, one of the things that's brought over was the public school system. Right? And so we can see the idea of a public school system started in the university and then spread to the rest of the general public. Another thing was the idea of social safety nets. Now, in the United States, especially because of the United States' history and traditional temperament, it was a bit more difficult to sell people in the United States on a social safety net than it was on public schools, and so that came later with us. You had state level welfare services, but the first real big federal welfare thing was Social Security. And then, 30 years later, Medicare and the Great Society, and it's been, and then I forget when income security came about, or federal unemployment came about. Anyway, and so the university is kind of the beginning point of any ideological change. Now, this should not be confused with direct power. The university is actually very weak in a direct sense. Like the university cannot organize a political revolution rapidly, right? Whereas the media can. The media can drum up support on a specific issue and get people to, say, march on DC. Right? The media can do that. The university by and large, can't. I mean, people who are at universities can do that if they have media support, but the university itself, by and large, it can't do much in terms of direct action. What the universities can do is depending on your point of view, enlighten or brainwash. Right? They change the views of incoming generations of kids who then go out and become the politicians, who then become the journalists and the lawmakers, right? And they become the engineers. And of course, if they become engineers, you may think, oh, well, they're just being taught engineering stuff or physics stuff, the STEMs. Well, in addition to their professional education, they're also given an ideological, quote-unquote, education. And this is and so the result is that your engineers and scientists tend to be more quote-unquote progressive than the general public because they had this university conditioning, right? And so that provides some prestige to those views. Although, and for up until the 2008 election, or at least the 2012 election, voters of the Democrat Party have been more educated than voters for the Republican Party, although that was not the case. No, I take that back. That wasn't even the case in the 2010 midterms. I believe 2010 was finally when Republican voters were more educated than Democrat voters. But for a long time, the more educated people tended to support the Democrat Party more, which lended prestige to the Democrat Party. And certainly, even if they don't support the Democrat Party but are Republicans, they tend to definitely have integrationist racial views, tend to view any kind of race identity as downright demonic. And so there's a prestige. So even though your doctors and your biologists and your research scientists, even though they are not political activists, getting these kinds of people to hold your views increases the prestige of your views, and the fact that politicians and journalists all have to go through the university system. That's pretty self-explanatory. The power that these people have. Okay, and so back. That's a very long tangent, but back to free speech. Okay, you can have free speech in general, but not at the universities. Oh, well, isn't that convenient? So what you get is you get this nominal free speech, but you can't have free speech where it counts. See, which is at the universities, right? Because the universities, well, this is where you get the concentrations of people who are going to be journalists, politicians, and hold and in the what I'll call the prestigious professions. You can't have free speech at this area, at this critical juncture, at the halls of power. Free speech is not allowed. Right? It's very convenient. But of course, you're allowed free speech outside of the halls of power, where it doesn't count. But where it does count, which is the university, speech codes are allowed because they're private. Or even if they're public, they're somehow pseudo-private, right? So that's a big difference between substantive and nominal free speech. Substantive free speech requires free speech to be allowed at the universities, right? Holocaust revisionism at the universities. That's free speech. That's substantive free speech, right? Also, another thing that you need for free speech, and let's go talk about the Holocaust some more, is when someone says Holocaust deniers, well, that is an impediment to free speech, right? Because part of free speech is that ideas actually get out there, right? The point of free speech is the exchange of ideas, right? And so, having this nominal free speech, but having all these barriers to the advancement of ideas against other ideas, what's the point, right? The point of free speech is the advancement of ideas, right? And so when you say Holocaust denier, well, that's opposition to free speech right there. Because because Holocaust denier is one of these slander terms, right? This idea that there are people who deny the existence of Bergen-Belsen, you know. Like there are these people who say Bergen-Belsen did not exist and there were no pits of dead people. Right? That kind of thing. You know, and that kind of ridiculous straw manning, that's that's a barrier to substantive free speech, even if free speech is nominally allowed. You know, and banning free speech at the university level, well, the people who get into the media then are all going to be of a certain political persuasion because you've shielded them from more complex thoughts. You've shielded them from good thinking and enforced shitty thinking only on them, right? So that's I've been going on a lot of tangents and been repeating, doing a lot of looping in this video. So I guess one other thing I wanted to talk about was substantive versus nominal economic freedom. But of course, that gets really complex because then you have people saying, well, economic freedom is to have money to be able to do things. I'll just talk about it like this. Two regimes, the former Confederate States of America and Tsarist Russia, had anti-vagrancy laws, which is where if you had a very short period of time in which you were allowed to be unemployed, before which you would be arrested. And in the South, that you would be arrested and you would be put into a chain gang, right? Basically a prison work detail. Similar things happened in Russia. If you were unemployed for any significant period of time, you would be sent to prison and put into a labor camp where you would do something useful to the state. And what that did was, even though in Russia you had the right to quit your job and go work at another place, the practical effect of this was that no one was willing to take that risk because no one wanted to be sent to the gulag. Essentially. And this is before the Soviet Union. This is in Tsarist times. And so the effect was, because you weren't allowed to be unemployed for very long, was that people were trapped in whatever job that they had, and so they could be screwed over by their bosses. Right? And one of their bosses could be a kulak, a rich peasant, who had a bunch of poor peasants working for him, a bunch of poor peasants who would like to quit and go look for another job, but they couldn't because if a new job wasn't forthcoming, then they would be sent to a prison labor camp somewhere, perhaps in Siberia. Why Siberia? Well, because the Russian government was interested in colonizing that area and making it Russian. So, and of course, a similar thing in the Confederate States of America. The anti-vagrancy laws there prevented people from going out and finding new work. It caused people to hold on to whatever jobs they had, which allowed them to be paid shit wages and be treated like crap. And of course, a result in both the former Confederate States of America and Tsarist Russia was a lack of industrialization. Right, this policy of not letting people go unemployed for any significant period of time resulted in both of these regimes not industrializing. Okay, and that is a and so in the United States today, now we can see that law is that greatly reduces the economic freedom of the individual and results in massive exploitation. And in the United States today, if you hyper-regulate the economy, and this is something, and of course I've had people on this channel who have been battling against this, if you allow free trade globally, and other countries have tariffs, but you stick to free trade, you end up losing your your fiber optics industry to China. You end up losing your computer hardware industry to China, your auto industry to China, right? All these high-paying manufacturing jobs. And in the United States, you have a situation where as these jobs become more and more scarce, you get people getting more and more degreed for jobs that don't exist, that are going elsewhere. This creates a kind of lack of economic freedom. One thing I'll talk about is college loans. You get people going to college because in order to get a good job, you have to get a college degree. Now, even if the college degree doesn't do anything, right? It's just, a signal. It signals to an employer, hey, I'm employable material. And evidence of this can be seen in job performance ratings, which is that education level. I mean, aside from, I guess, really specialized things, like in order to run a cracking tower, you really have to know what you're doing. But aside from really specialized degrees, education level has no predictive power independent of a general mental ability test. Right? And if you combine a general mental ability test with what is called a conscientiousness test, that's the best thing. And really, the general mental ability test carries the weight of prediction in terms of job performance, as subjectively rated by peers and by supervisors. So, I think it's something that a lot of people have suspected, and it appears to be the case based on what Hunter and Hunter, their analysis of the signaling theory of education, which is that people go to school in order to get a degree so that they can stand out from all these people who don't have a degree. Now, but this is kind of a sick situation, because part of the reason everyone's having to do this is because first, it's a cultural thing. You have the college cult. People are convinced at a young age you got to go to college, blah blah blah. And you're actually seeing a thing that's kind of like the way healthcare is done, right? It's not done rationally. Like you compare how a car is bought versus how healthcare is bought. You have people looking at great detail as to the car they get, but almost no detail as to what doctor they get. They just go, "Oh, this is my health plan. This is the doctor they chose. I'm just going to go along with it," right? Very different kind of mentality. And unfortunately, with college, you're seeing that same thing. People, well, I go to college. This is what you do. It's for your future, or whatever. But no real thought as to what it's actually doing. But the reason people are going to college is so they can get a credential. And the reason they need a credential is because the high-level jobs are going overseas, and there's a shortage of them. And so competition for these jobs is getting fiercer and fiercer. But the sick thing about it is that because the competition for these jobs is getting fiercer and fiercer because there's relatively fewer of them, because of this, individuals have to go to college more and more and more. And the end result is that more and more people are going into debt, going to college, while the available pool of jobs is shrinking, all while, the going to college thing doesn't actually assist in job performance except for a minority of degrees. And even then, you might be surprised at how little of a computer programming degree actually helps you in terms of actually computer programming. So, and so that is a situation where the substantive economic freedom has been greatly reduced in the United States as a result of increasing trade freedom. All right. And here's another thing I would say. If you put a hard legal limit on the number of people who went to college, the substantive economic freedom would increase, right? Because less people would be going to college. And a greater proportion of those people who were going to college would be those who absolutely need to go to college. People who want to become, for example, aeronautics engineers, right? Who you have to go to college in order to do that, or something like college to do that, right? perhaps the 4-year education. I think the 4-year education system is completely obsolete, but you have to do something like college in order to become an aeronautics engineer. Okay. So, but anyway, but if you put a hard legal limit on how many people were allowed to go to college, well, sure, you would be reducing their economic freedom, because then a large proportion of people would not be free to go to college. That is true. So in that sense, they would be made less free because they would not be allowed to go to college. However, they would start work earlier. The people around them who they are competing for jobs would also not be going to college, right? The actual economic output would be the same because these college degrees are not providing value. And they would not be in debt to the college cult, and they would have a few more years of working, right? But they would go from being $100,000 in the hole when they start working at 22 to being $10,000 in the positive, or maybe more, depending on how diligent they are in their savings after 4 years of working at age 22. See? Or, assuming they graduate in 4 years, which is becoming less and less of an assumed thing. So I see, for example, restricting trade freedom and placing a hard legal limit on the number of people who are allowed to go to college. Doing these two things would increase substantive economic freedom that an individual actually experiences in his own personal life. Okay. I would also argue that single-payer healthcare would, A, drastically reduce medical service costs, and by drastically reducing medical service costs would result in people not having to spend as much money on healthcare, which means they're less economically constrained by healthcare costs or potential healthcare costs, potential catastrophic healthcare costs. So that would be another situation in which they're economically more free, in a more substantive way. And I guess I'm sounding a little bit like a anarchist, classical anarchist in that sense. But that's kind of how I'm beginning to see it. Now, there's problems with it, is that people can use this substantive economic freedom to argue for a lot of shitty things, right? You can get arguments for substantive economic freedom in order to argue that you need to subsidize this or that thing that they want, right? I want, a car. Give me a car. That gives me more economic freedom. See, and that's the same kind of argument that I'm using for single-payer healthcare. Give me single-payer healthcare. That will give me more economic freedom. You support economic freedom, right? Well, economic freedom in a substantive sense, often, and in my view, usually goes against the strict American libertarian notion of economic freedom. So it's very muddled and very, very unclear, and so in terms of substantive versus nominal economic freedom, another way can be looked at it. Another way can be looked at is positive and negative economic freedom. But yeah, I think substantive and nominal is a better distinction. But that, of course, can be seen as pejorative, like, oh, you don't support substantive economic, you only support nominal economic freedom, right? And I don't mean it that way, but that's how it comes across. And so which is a better dichotomy, positive versus negative economic freedom, or substantive versus nominal economic freedom? They don't say the same things, these dichotomies. Positive and negative economic freedom, I mean, of course, positive economic freedom is about freedom to do things, right? Freedom of the individual to do things. And negative economic freedom is more of a freedom from other people doing things to you. whereas I say substantive economic freedom. Well, that's substantive economic freedom is the freedom that an individual experiences in their day-to-day life. And this freedom that they experience in their day-to-day life includes both negative freedom from and freedom to, right? Freedom from other people, coming into their house and just, doing whatever they want in their house, right? So substantive economic freedom can be negative, right? It can also be positive, whereas and substantive economic freedom deals more with what the individual actually experiences, whereas nominal economic freedom is a much more of a legal thing. For example, free trade. Like nominal freedom is free trade. Nominal freedom is allowing people to go to college as much as they want, right? That's nominal freedom. Okay, but I think that reducing nominal freedom, that reducing the number of people who can go to college, and reducing freedom from trade restrictions, right? Reducing negative freedom in terms of reducing freedom from trade restrictions, and reducing positive freedom in terms of freedom to go to college. Right? I believe that that the freedom to go to college is nominal positive. Right? So it is a positive freedom, and it's nominal. And freedom from trade restrictions is negative and nominal. And restricting both of these things will increase substantive economic freedom of the individual who is not saddled with the college debt, which kind of is like, I mean, given the amount of time it takes to pay off, is kind of like, indentured servitude. I mean, if you're an indentured servant for 7 years, well, how long does it take to pay off your college loans? Like 5 years? 5 to 10 years, depending on how diligent you are. Well, that sounds a lot like indentured servitude. So yeah, that's just a random video about what I'm thinking about substantive versus nominal multiculturalism, substantive versus nominal economic freedom, and substantive versus nominal free speech.